Will Smith. What is he? Part 10. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. You have now, or you ought to have done if you know what's good for you, to have listened to 9 riveting parts where I have taken a large body of information about Will Smith and provided you with observation, suggestion and analysis as to what those behaviours might mean. We now come to the conclusion to determine what is he. And of course the starting point is to make an assessment as to what he is by reference to my classification system of is he a narcissist? Is he narcissistic? Is he normal? Or is he an empath? Empathic people can be manipulative, but they don't do as a matter of course. It's rarely instinctive, and they often aren't very good at it. Empathic people have emotional empathy for a wide range of individuals, and there are different categories of empath, but we hold on that part for now. Their emotional empathy operates in an instinctive, unconscious manner, along with conscious decision-making about how their behaviour impacts upon other people. Empathic people can have moderate empathic traits and moderate narcissistic traits. Some can have very high empathic traits and very low narcissistic traits. Some can have high narcissistic traits and very high empathic traits. But the point is that the narcissistic traits that do exist, and everybody has narcissistic traits, are kept in check by those empathic traits. Normal people also have emotional empathy, but for a smaller grouping of individuals. And they also have narcissistic and empathic traits, but they tend to be less strong, and they lean more towards being empathic and lean more towards being narcissistic. They don't habitually have emotional empathy for strangers unless the situation alters, for example, but have that emotional empathy for friends, family, their children, their parents, a neighbour, a sibling, maybe a colleague, and a few more. Narcissistic people have low emotional empathy, but it's there. They're high on narcissistic traits, low on empathic traits. They can be manipulative and invariably know that they are. Narcissists have no emotional empathy whatsoever. Some have cognitive empathy, are manipulative, mostly unconsciously and instinctively. Some, the rarer breed, do so in an aware fashion. There are no empathic traits, only fake empathic traits, and strong and multiple narcissistic traits. There's a lot more to say about those categorizations, but that's to give you a rough overview. And we're looking to see where Will Smith fits into, based on the information that I have analysed. Is he empath, normal, narcissistic, or narcissist? Does he function with a sense of entitlement? Well, he has a tendency to expect perfection. He wants everything to be just so, which is a narcissistic behaviour. But most evidence of him operating with a sense of entitlement is actually missing. What about the question of accountability? He issues apologies, and he puts effort into looking after friends and family. We've seen how his member of the cast from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, he apologised to many years later. We see that he repeatedly engages in actions rather than necessarily just talking about it, to contrast with other individuals that have been put under the Tudor. Early, he was financially haphazard, which is a narcissistic behaviour, but that has been remedied. He offers emotional support to people. He's not known for being unpunctual. Indeed, he offers more of his time than ordinarily many stars would do so. With regard to grandiosity, there is evidence here. He engages in considerable showmanship. He uses flowery language. There's evidence of financial largesse. He's known for boasting and bragging, and there is vanity, and therefore he scores highly with regard to grandiosity. I've seen no evidence of magical thinking. Haughtiness, he has dismissiveness and arrogance at times, and in a couple of instances has been known of having a reputation for being difficult. For instance, on the set of Ali, he was regarded as being difficult to work with, although the individual that commented did say it might have been down to him being exhausted. And of course, exhaustion is an external stressor which can reduce emotional empathy. With regard to manipulative behaviour, we do see some. There's the suggestion of flattery and bribery, triangulation with object, triangulation with person, use of a present silent treatment, witness the incident after the 40th birthday, use of physical violence. Chris Rock can tell you all about that. The journalist can tell you about that. I think he had an altercation with somebody else at the Oscars. Was it Edward Norton? He does potentially seem to engage in pity play. There's a use of threat, insult, shouting, and argumentativeness. Understand that, as mentioned, it's not just narcissists who can be manipulative, and one needs to consider what the driver is for those behaviours. Is it the pursuit of the prime aims, or are some of these behaviours driven by emotional empathy, for instance, complimenting somebody, flattering them, or the erosion of emotional empathy causing the individual to behave in an unpleasant fashion, use of insult, shouting, argumentativeness. So there are manipulations there, but we need to consider carefully what's behind them. There's an absence of boundary recognition issues. He is flirtatious, and there is a question of sexual fluidity, although there is no real concrete evidence in that regard. He's not known for talking over people or interrupting people incessantly. He's not seen as being a self-inviter. He's not somebody who's interfered in other people's relationships. And he's not been known for preaching confidence, and there are many other indicators of boundary recognition problems that are absent. What about the narcissistic dynamic? Well, there is familial discord. That's been well documented. And there is a sense of paranoia, which is linked to his devotion to try and make things right. But beyond that, he doesn't show any other aspects of the narcissistic dynamic. Accordingly, as a consequence of most indicators with regard to a sense of entitlement being missing, we wouldn't see that the threshold would be met. What about the consideration of empathy? He's clearly got the ability that would be seen as cognitive empathy. He has done things for people. He has donated to charities, has engaged in philanthropy. There's no real commission of infidelity, although there's been a suggestion of other relationships. One questions whether that's actually occurred and whether it was done more at the behest of his wife's behaviour upon him, or if it was done during a period of separation. There have been repeated examples of the exhibition of emotional empathy towards his mother, with regard to even towards his father, notwithstanding the treatment of him, towards his wife and his children, in the way that he seeks to protect people, the way that he seeks to help those individuals, and it isn't done for facade management. There's a genuine demonstration of emotional empathy. Accordingly, with most of the indicators for a sense of entitlement missing, he doesn't cross the evidential threshold. He exhibits emotional empathy. He demonstrates accountability for behaviours. There is evidence of grandiosity, but that is to be expected with somebody that's clearly got strong narcissistic traits and, of course, the world in which he operates. There's an absence of magical thinking. There's a degree of haughty behaviours. The manipulations that he engages in are manipulations, but they're either driven from a position of emotional empathy, flattery, gift buying, or as a consequence of the erosion of his emotional empathy as a consequence of external stressors. Witness his father's behaviour towards him, the fact that he was bullied as a child, and, of course, the repeated behaviour of his wife over the last 22 years has impacted on him considerably. Therefore, when he has been manipulative through the use of physical violence, insult, shouting, argumentativeness, for instance, arguing with his wife, this has invariably come as a consequence of the application of an external stressor, namely abuse, which has eroded his emotional empathy. There are not sufficient indicators of the narcissistic dynamic at all. A vast multitude of them are absent. Accordingly, the conclusion is that Will Smith is not a narcissist. So, having established that he is not a narcissist, where does this take us to? Perhaps he's narcissistic. Well, we have seen the grandiosity and the haughty behaviours, but his level of emotional empathy isn't just for a small circle of people around him. For instance, he exhibited it quite clearly towards Bridget Moynihan. The way that he talks about how he would always try and appease a journalist with an interview, the time that is given. And therefore, in those circumstances, he shows more emotional empathy than will be witnessed by somebody that's narcissistic. Is he a normal? That is potentially an outcome for him. the exhibition of emotional empathy, but again, he appears to go outside of the traditional tight circle that's associated there. His narcissistic traits as well are pretty strong for somebody that would be normal. The normals tend to have moderate and below with regard to their empathic and narcissistic traits. And therefore, on balance, normal wouldn't be appropriate. Also, one would discount it for reasons with regard to the relationship that he has with his wife, something that will be touched on in a further episode. This leaves us with empath. His background was one of a genetic predisposition towards narcissism because his father clearly is a narcissist. And it's likely, although not certain, that that genetic predisposition has been passed on to Will Smith. He clearly grew up in a lack of control environment, an environment of tension, anxiety, physical violence being used against him, physical violence being used against his mother and his siblings. This would create the blueprint for the creation of a narcissist. And Will Smith started out moving towards becoming one. However, he had numerous intervening factors. His grandmother, who was a considerable intervening factor that has been mentioned many times. His mother, his sister, who protected him, even witnessing his brother's response to his father's antagonisms, saying, "I'm not going to cry." All of those were intervening factors which provided an alleviation from the lack of control environment. And instead, rather than narcissism form as his self-defense and coping mechanism, it took him to an alternative position to enable him to cope, namely that of the use of humour, trying to better himself, placating people, and pleasing them. His childhood experience has created in him an addiction to narcissists. Witness the slavish devotion that he exhibits towards his wife, which is commensurate with the addiction of an empathic individual. He experiences emotional thinking, driving him to remain in the dynamic with her, trying to make things right with her, notwithstanding the various abuses, although he may not even recognise many of them, that he has suffered. He has strong narcissistic traits, quite possibly very strong, and that's to be expected with somebody who's a performer, an actor, and an entertainer, but they're shrouded in and cocooned by his empathic traits. We have seen multiple instances of the darker side of Will Smith appear, and that's as a consequence of the erosion of his emotional empathy, as a consequence of external stresses, such as fatigue, and most notably, abuse. The fact remains that he has suffered repeated abuse through his relationship with his wife, and that has led to him having eroded emotional empathy, and therefore his narcissistic traits, such as anger, such as argumentativeness, such as resentment and defiance, come to the fore, and it causes him to lash out. He's argued with her. He's lashed out at other individuals, for instance, Chris Rock. It's caused him, perhaps, to make comments about people which were ill-judged. But ultimately, what you're dealing with Will Smith, is an empathic individual. He doesn't have the multitude of indicators to support a finding of narcissism and does not get over the evidential threshold in that regard. He has extensive emotional empathy, which is repeatedly eroded as a consequence of an external stressor, causing him to act out. And therefore the conclusion for Will Smith is he is an empath. This is a detailed series, and it would be appreciated if you would show your gratitude for the amount of work that's gone into this and the entertainment that you've received. Please show super thanks. Ensure that you like the video and share it elsewhere, and encourage people to utilize it to increase their understanding of narcissism and empaths. The question then remains, which school and cadre of empath is Will Smith? And that can be found in a further part. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.